approaches that provide opportunities for feed-forward to future assessments can also enhance the approach of adaptive release of grades in order for students to get the most benefit from it. I'm just going to step back to the previous bullet point where I'm talking about outlining student responsibilities, because I think this goes back to something that Jeff questioned earlier on in the webinar. Towards the end of the project, we employed one of our students to work with us to help us in both analysing the student data that we got through the interviews, and also in writing the recommendations, but also in writing some good practice guides for students. And one of the things that Claire, who we employed, drew for us is a way of trying to get students to understand the entire assessment process and the importance of reflection and feeding forward into future assessments. I'll just show you the diagram that she outlined. We called it the assessment timeline, and I apologise that on this screen it may look quite small. However, I will, towards the end of this webinar, show you where you can see this timeline, where you can download it and access it and use it with your own students. But essentially, Claire just drew a timeline or a diagram where she explains to students that the assessment process doesn't end when students have completed and submitted an assignment. There are still further stages in the assessment process, which includes reading your feedback, reflecting on your feedback, and using feedback to feed forward. And like I say, I will show you how to get access to this diagram where you can read it more legibly towards the end of the webinar. And finally, putting into practice the idea of linking feedback to assessment criteria. Again, find out whether there's technology and support available at your institution to enable you to easily generate individual documents that link feedback to assessment criteria. And it's certainly important that assessment criteria is provided at the start of the assessment process so students understand what is expected. Many students told us the importance of having the assessment criteria up front, as it also enables them to complete and self-assess their work against this criteria. If using generic feedback statements, make sure that you accompany these by individual comments that personalise the feedback for each student. Similarly, make sure that the generic comments don't just reaffirm the grades, but enable students to feed forward and demonstrate what they would need to do to achieve higher. Consider keeping the grade awarded for each assessment criterion, as well as the overall grade hidden from the feedback template or grid, to encourage students to engage with the feedback in the total absence of the grade. And finally, whatever method of presenting feedback, always write it in the context of the student's original work. Students can see immediately or easily refer to the point that you are talking about. So that concludes everything I wish to discuss during the webinar and the slides. One final thing I would like to point out is that as a consequence of the research project, we have developed a series of best practice guides and a short report. All these guides and short reports are available to download from the URLs presented on the slide. And in terms of the best practice guides, we have the best practice guide for students to enable them to make the most of their feedback. And it's in this document that you will see the assessment timeline that I outlined a couple of slides ago. There is also a best practice guide for academic staff, which goes into more detail about the putting into practice information. And we also have a guide for senior managers. Now, the guide for senior managers is promoted as a 10-minute guide, but even if your senior management don't have 10 minutes to look at this guide, we are assured that looking at one of the page 2, I believe, allows them to read the guide or digest the guide in 2 minutes. So there's no excuse for them not to engage with the guide.
Sorry, I just couldn't help but smile when you were saying that, Stuart, that we have to produce a very short version for the senior managers. So I did quite smile with that one.
No, thank you. Well, we understand that they're always too busy, so we thought if they could digest it in 2 minutes, or if they've got 10 minutes to spare over coffee, then they're more likely to engage with it. Okay, thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions now that you have, or if you've got any questions outside of this webinar, feel free to email me at my email address, which is at the bottom of this slide. And in a minute, I will put back up the best practice guide and short report slide, so that if you want to note down the URL, feel free to do so.
Yeah, Stuart, thank you very much for that. You've actually there's a lot of nice resources in there. And as you've been talking, I've been going out and having a look at the websites and having a look at some of the resources up there. So I think they're going to be very, very useful for people. It's really an interesting issue, this whole business about feedback for students, because certainly here in Australia, it's one of the questions that we always have on our student surveys about the quality of the feedback or the amount of feedback that students receive. And it's probably the question in every institution in Australia that gets probably some of the lowest scores. Students certainly don't perceive, at the majority of universities here in Australia, that they're getting quality feedback. And obviously there's been a lot of discussion here about that because the academic staff insist they do give lots of feedback to the students. It's just that the students either A, don't realise it's feedback, or B, they're not sure what to do with it, so they don't actually perceive it as being particularly useful for the next thing that they have to do. Hence, that was why I was asking, I guess, just a couple of those questions there about how, in terms of the feedback that we give to students, do we actually distinguish between the different types of feedback that we give, so that there's feedback that we give which is for immediate action, that is, it's to do with the current learning and things that students could improve on immediately. There are other things that we give them which, over time and reflection and a bit of practice and things, that they would be able to get better and then use it in a future activity too. And I suppose in my institution here in Adelaide, I don't think we're particularly good at distinguishing between the two different types of feedback and the purposes of the two different types of feedback. So I just wonder whether you had any comments to make on that, Stuart.
Similarly, in our National Student Survey, most institutions' scores are brought down by students responding quite poorly to that question on assessment and feedback. But as such, a lot of institutions are focusing on why is it students are dissatisfied with feedback. And at Sheffield Hallam in particular, one of the things that came out of some work that they did is that for many students, they just don't recognise what feedback is. And even when they do recognise what feedback is, and for many, they just recognise feedback as being the written comment on the end of their assessment, that they don't know what to do with it.